Classical Hebrew, Introduction and Text Samples. Hello, welcome everybody, thanks for tuning in, Shalom Aleichem, and this is my next video, and I'm covering every Semitic language, one language per video. In my last video I was talking about Ugaritic, and this video will be about Classical Hebrew. So let's start and have a look at Classical Hebrew. So the Hebrew language is of course a Semitic language, otherwise it wouldn't be on my channel. It is a Northwest Semitic language, just like Ugaritic. I was talking about Ugaritic in my last video, and also together with Aramaic. So again, for the subgrouping of Semitic languages, I can refer you to my first video, which was an introduction to the Semitic languages. So you see what sub-branches are there in the Semitic language family and what languages belong to what sub-branch of Semitic. But today we're talking about one of the Northwest Semitic languages. And Hebrew is not just a Northwest Semitic language, actually it is a variety of the Canaanite language. So Northwest Semitic is subdivided into Ugaritic, Aramaic, and Canaanite, and then Canaanite can further be divided into several languages, dialects, varieties, whatever you want to call it. And you can check this map I've made. On this map you see in blue you see the Canaanite languages. In the north you see Phoenician. So Phoenician was spoken in the Phoenician city-states like Tyre and Acre in the north, and then south of it mostly in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah was the Hebrew speaking area. And a little further to the east we would have Ammonite and Moabite, and to the south Edomite. So the areas are not fully accurate, but mostly based on the kingdoms in ancient times in the first millennium BCE, and also on inscriptions and other attestations of those languages that were found. So this is more or less roughly the Canaanite speaking area, and this part is Hebrew. To the east, especially to the northeast, you would have found Aramaic in the past, and more to the southeast early varieties of Arabic or Old North Arabian. On the Sinai Peninsula in the south also North Arabian varieties. Some of them would be called Thamudic. And in this area, so around the area of modern Gaza, you would have found in the past, you would have found the Philistines who were speaking, we don't know exactly what, but they are probably from the Aegean area or from some other part of the Mediterranean area, but more like from the European side of the Mediterranean area. And then further to the west, of course, Egyptian. So yeah, that's the area and the time when Classical Hebrew was spoken and was codified. Just to give you an overall chronology of Hebrew, so we have something called Paleo-Hebrew, which is old inscriptions, etc., pre-11th century BCE. And then from the 11th century BCE on until the 1st century, we have what we call Classical Hebrew, which is the language of the Tanakh or the Old Testament or whatever you want to call it. I'll talk about that more in detail. After that, which means 1st century BCE till 4th century CE, we have Mishnaic Hebrew, and also some other things like Qumran Hebrew, which was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then at some point Hebrew became extinct as a spoken language. It was mostly replaced by Aramaic as an everyday language, but it was continued as a liturgical language of Judaism and also as a literary language. So Jewish scholars also produced new literature in Hebrew, even though they didn't speak it as an everyday language. So at that point we call it medieval Hebrew. And that is from the 4th century to the 19th century CE. And in the 19th century CE, Hebrew was revived. It is probably the most successful revived language in the world. And from that point on, from that time on we call it Modern Hebrew, and Modern Hebrew is the official language of the modern state of Israel and spoken by most of the people who live in that state. So those are the different chronological stages of Hebrew, and this video will be about classical Hebrew. All right, so let's talk a little more about classical Hebrew. So classical Hebrew is a corpus language. That means it is the language of a certain text, of a certain collection of texts, if you want to call it like that. And the corpus is the Torah, Navi'im, Wuchatuvim, also known as the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So whenever we talk about classical Hebrew, or it's also called biblical Hebrew, we talk about what we find in the Old Testament. Okay, and you can see a picture of a kind of Torah scroll here. And this language is even further subdivided into several chronological stages, because even within this text we can see changes happening, changes in orthography, vocabulary, syntax, morphology, etc. So the first stage is called archaic, classical or biblical Hebrew, which is dated to 1100 till 1000 BCE. So these are probably the very oldest portions of the Old Testament, and we find this language, this archaic classical Hebrew, mostly in poetic parts of the Old Testament, whereas most of the prose parts, the non-poetic parts, are classified as standard classical Hebrew or standard biblical Hebrew, and those are the parts that were written between 1000 BCE and approximately 550 BCE. After 550 BCE, we see even more changes in the language, a lot of Aramaic influence in morphology and lexicon, and at that point we call it late classical Hebrew, and this was written until around 200 BCE, and at that point the corpus was more or less finished and the whole process was completed. So these are the different stages of Hebrew that we find in the Old Testament. Not outside of it. We're not talking about Qumran or something like that here, so only in the text corpus of the Tanakh, of the Torah, Navi'im, Wuchatuvim. So how did the writing change? What was the history of the text? So first of all, Hebrew, like many Semitic languages, especially West Semitic languages, was written in a purely consonantal script. So we have a purely consonant text underlying the language of the Old Testament. And at first, the script looked significantly different from what it looks like today. We call that script Paleo-Hebrew. You can see an example in this inscription, the Gezer calendar, and it looks much more similar to Phoenician than to modern Hebrew. So this script was used at the beginning of the history or of the codification of the Old Testament, and then at some point from the 6th century BCE on, it started being gradually replaced by Aramaic, by the Aramaic script, which looked different than the Paleo-Hebrew script. They both originated in the Phoenician script, but looked significantly different at that point. So from the 6th century BCE on, the Aramaic script started replacing the Paleo-Hebrew script, and a new Hebrew script, what we call the Hebrew script today, started developing. It took some time. Letter shapes changed over time, and at some point, probably around the 1st century, the evolution of the Hebrew script, meaning not the Paleo-Hebrew, but what we know as Hebrew today, was more or less finished. So letter shapes changed, and the result is what is still used today. It was still consonantal for a while until around the 6th century CE, when Hebrew was not used as a spoken language anymore, and apparently scholars or people who used Hebrew as a liturgical language needed some kind of system to help them memorize the pronunciation, because memorizing sacred texts is more difficult if the language is not your native language. So different scholars in different kinds of the Jewish world, of the Hebrew using world, came up with different vocalization systems. Probably the oldest one was the Babylonian system, which was developed in the 6th century CE. A little later, around the 7th century, the Palestinian system was developed, and both were finally ultimately replaced by the Tiberian system around the 8th century CE. And this is the system of Hebrew vowels which is still used today, and which is very important for what I'm doing here today, namely giving you a guide on how to pronounce classical Tiberian Hebrew. That's also what I'm calling a Tiberian Hebrew. It's known as the Tiberian pronunciation tradition. So how to read and pronounce classical Hebrew. Before we go over the alphabet letter by letter, there are different periods of pronunciation, because pronunciation, of course, changed over time, even when the writing remained more or less the same. And the oldest period of Hebrew phonology that we can somehow define is often called Proto-Hebrew. Basically, it's pre-Tiberian, which means the pronunciation of the Hebrew language prior to the invention of the Tiberian vocalization system. And so this covers several centuries, basically from Paleo-Hebrew till around the 7th, 8th century CE. So during those days, during those centuries, of course, the pronunciation was changing gradually. But there are some features that existed in the Hebrew language at some point that we don't have in the Tiberian tradition anymore. So let me just sum up some of those features. One feature of Proto-Hebrew, at least up to some point in time, is that this letter, which today is called Chet, I would pronounce it Heith in the Tiberian tradition, had two different, or it represented two different phonemes, namely Ha and Cha. So they are basically in pronunciation equivalent to Arabic Ha and Cha. Okay. Likewise, the letter Ayin represented two different phonemes, namely A and Ra. So a voiced pharyngeal fricative and a voiced uvular fricative. And this letter, well, it still has two different pronunciations today. There's Sin and Shin, but at some point in Proto-Hebrew, instead of Sin, you still had this voiceless lateral fricative, so they said Hin. Okay, the two different pronunciations of that letter were thus Sha and Sha. Okay, these two, so the Ha and Cha, merged at some point, even before the invention of the Tiberian vocalization system. At some point they just merged, as in many other Semitic languages. And in the same way, A and Ra merged, and Sha didn't merge with a Sha like it did in Phoenician, but with Samech, with a plain S sound, which is why still today we have these two pronunciations of that letter, Sin and Shin. Okay, let me just give you some examples to show you what I'm talking about. So for example, the number 1 in Proto-Hebrew, at some point you would have pronounced it Ahad. Okay, so here the Ha letter represents actual Ha, Ahad, but in the word for 5 it was Ch, so they said Chamisha. Okay, Ahad and Chamisha, and it's the same as in Arabic, Wahid and Khamsa, and in many other Semitic languages. Another word, the word for west, would have been pronounced Maghrab at some point of time in Proto-Hebrew, Maghrab. Later it became Ma'arav. Okay, so the Ghain sound became A, Ma'rav. But at some point it was Maghrab. But Ain, or Ayin, as it later was pronounced with a diphthong being broken, it was always Ain. It was always a voiced pharyngeal fricative. And finally, the word for 10, at some point it was pronounced Ashara. Ashara. Okay, it later became Asara. So these sounds disappeared from Hebrew phonology when the Tiberian vocalization system was introduced. They were apparently gone, have merged with other sounds, but there are some sources that tell us that at certain points of time these sounds were still there. For example, in the Greek Septuagint translation, so the Greek translation of the Old Testament, if we look at how how Hebrew names are rendered in the Greek alphabet, we can get some hints that the pronunciation of Cha and Ra was still there. And also borrowings from Hebrew into other languages can sometimes tell us that in certain points of history those sounds were still there, and it also gives us estimates as to when these sounds disappeared from the language. So that is Proto-Hebrew, though in my video I will not focus on Proto-Hebrew so much, but on the next period of pronunciation of Hebrew, namely Tiberian Hebrew. And with Tiberian Hebrew I mean the way Hebrew was pronounced after the introduction of the Tiberian vowel system, because at that point, first of all, we do have vowels in the script, but also at that point, or shortly after that, there were several treatises by Jewish grammarians describing the pronunciation of Hebrew, which is something we don't have before, but from that point on, it seemed to become a necessity to describe the pronunciation of Hebrew to students, to keep the correct what in their opinion was correct, to keep the correct pronunciation of Hebrew alive. So the features of Tiberian Hebrew, well, you will see it on the following slides when I explain each letter, but basically these sounds up here, they merged, and the vowel system changed, and also the spirantization of Begat Kefat letters was introduced. It was brought from Aramaic, probably under Aramaic influence, and yeah, you will see it in detail. And the sources for this are, for example, the grammarians I just spoke about. One very famous one is al-Faraǧ Hārūn, also known as Aaron of Jerusalem, who was a Qāriʼ Jewish scholar from Jerusalem, living in the 11th century, and he wrote the Hidāyat al-Qāriʼ, the guide of the reader, and gave very detailed descriptions of the pronunciation of Hebrew. But also transliterations. There are, for example, transliterations of certain Hebrew texts into other writing systems from those days, especially Arabic, because Arabic, I mean, during the 10th, 11th century, etc., Arabic became the most spoken language in that region, in the Near East. So there are transliterations into Arabic that also help us figure out the pronunciation in those days. And apart from that, there are many Hebrew traditions that developed after a while, like the Sephardi tradition, the Ashkenazi. I misspelled it, so Ashkenazi, but it's actually Ashkenazi, of course. The Ashkenazi tradition, the Yemeni tradition, and some of them also allow us some insight. Especially the Yemeni tradition allows us a lot of insight into how Tiberian Hebrew was once pronounced, because the Yemeni pronunciation tradition is very conservative, though it does not 100% represent the original Tiberian pronunciation from the 11th century. Of course, there were also some changes that can be explained by the influence of Arabic on the pronunciation of Hebrew. So what we call the Tiberian Hebrew pronunciation from the 11th century, from the Hidāyat al-Qāriʼ, for example, differs more or less from any other Hebrew pronunciation tradition that is still practiced today. And of course, it differs a lot from how modern Hebrew is pronounced. So let's start with the alphabet letter by letter, and the first letter is And yeah, let me explain the charts I give you here. So in the first column, I always give you the letter, the way it looks like, then the transliteration that is used in Semitic linguistics, etc. The name in transliteration, so this one is called Aleph, and then I always give you three different pronunciations. The first one is reconstructed Proto-Hebrew, the second one is Tiberian, mostly based on the Hidāyat al-Qāriʼ and some other sources that were summed up by the Semiticist Geoffrey Kahn in his book, the Tiberian pronunciation tradition. And then I also give you the modern pronunciation, which means modern Hebrew, Ivrit. And below, I always give you a couple of examples, usually in the Hebrew script, in transliteration, and in IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. And the IPA in my examples always refers to the Tiberian pronunciation tradition, because that's what I want to focus on. And yeah, this channel is called Ancient Semitic, not Modern Semitic, so I will not just use modern pronunciation traditions, because you can find it anywhere on YouTube. You can find Ashkenazi Jews reading the Torah in their pronunciation, and you can find Sephardic Jews reading it in their tradition. So why would I do the same thing? First of all, I'm not Jewish, I'm not a native speaker of Hebrew, but I'm a linguist and a Semiticist, and I'm interested in reconstructing the ancient or classical pronunciation of Semitic languages, which is why in this video I will focus on Tiberian. It is not the oldest way of reconstructing Hebrew, but it is the most reliable and accurate one, because we have these descriptions that I told you about. Okay, so first letter called Aleph, usually transliterated with this kind of apostrophe, and it has been a glottal stop if it represented a consonant through Hebrew history, though in modern Hebrew it sometimes is just omitted, but in Tiberian Hebrew it was a glottal stop unless it represented a vowel, unless it served as a vowel sign, but as a consonant sign it was a glottal stop. So usually it was a glottal stop at the beginning of words, like the word or, light, or also in the middle of words, like the word for 100, me'or. Okay, let me read the examples again. Or, me'or. And that is your first letter, Aleph. The second letter is called Beth, and in Proto-Hebrew it was just a B sound, a voiced bilabial stop, and then later, under the influence of Aramaic, all the non-emphatic voiced stops had these fricative allophones after vowels. So in Tiberian Hebrew you had these two pronunciations, b and v, and it really was v. There are descriptions that it was pronounced with the lip and the teeth, so it was not bilabial v, and it also was not a wow kind of sound. Before I thought it must have been something like that. It's also pronounced like that in Syriac, but now reading these descriptions, it seems like it was actually labiovelar, so it was pronounced v, just as it is in modern Hebrew. So two examples. First example, at the beginning of the word bayith, there it is a stop, bayith, but after a vowel, qāver. Okay, so the first one is bayith with b. The second example is qāver, qāver. The next letter is called Gimel. Gimel, so the Proto-Hebrew pronunciation, just a g, just a voiced velar stop, but then this one also was affected by the post-vocalic spirantization, and from the descriptions of grammarians like Aaron of Jerusalem, we know that also when it was pronounced as a fricative, its place of articulation was further back in the throat. So just giving you some phonetic details here, it seems like when it was a fricative, it was not a velar fricative, but a nuvular fricative. So it became r. This doesn't exist anymore in modern Hebrew, but it did in Tiberian Hebrew. So at the beginning of a word, we have like this word gibor, okay, with a g, gibor, and at the end of a word, not at the end, I mean after a vowel, so between vowels, like in this example, it became r, as in nerev. Okay, gibor and nerev. And in case you're confused, I will talk, of course, about the resh later. But first example, gibor, nerev, nerev. Next letter is daleth, daleth. So just a D in Proto-Hebrew, but it had a the allophone in the Tiberian pronunciation, which is not retained in modern Hebrew. So here I have just one example because it has both allophones of this phoneme, the name David. So at the beginning of the word it's the, but at the end, because it's after a vowel, it is the. So it's pronounced David. David. The next letter is he, and it has been pretty consistent throughout Hebrew history. It has been a voiceless glottal fricative, ha. So we have these examples: heichal, temple, heichal, and bethah. So it was quite rare at the end of words, but it existed. Bethah. Next example, the letter, well, in the past I thought it must have been pronounced wow, but yeah, I was convinced by the books and the descriptions I was talking about that it had two allophones, but mostly it was pronounced actually v as in modern Hebrew, which is kind of odd, but that's how, for example, also Aaron of Jerusalem describes it. It is pronounced just like the Beth with Rafi. So two different ways of pronouncing it, v and w. In modern Hebrew, only the v survived, also many other traditions. I think only the Yemeni tradition uses w. Okay, but let me just briefly explain when you use these two allophones. Basically, the w allophone is used if this letter is immediately preceded or followed by the vowel u, and in all other cases it is pronounced v. So I've given you a whole sentence as an example, and you can see, let me mark it for you. At the beginning you will see this letter vav in its most common form, v, but there is one case where it is immediately followed by the vowel u, and hence, according to the rules in the Hidāyat al-Qāriʼ, must be pronounced as w. So we would read this short verse: Vadyavdil Elohim ben ha'or wu ven ha'hoshech. Okay, let me read it again. Vadyavdil Elohim ben ha'or wu ven ha'hoshech. So two different allophones of the letter vav. The next letter is pretty easy. It is zayin, and it's just a z, a voiced sibilant. So the example we have here is zahov. Zahov. The next letter, in Proto-Hebrew, as I showed you before, it had two different ways of pronouncing it, namely ha and cha. They merged. So by the time Tiberian Hebrew was used, or let's say those medieval descriptions were written down, there was only one pronunciation left, namely the pharyngeal pronunciation ha. So for example, the word for 5, even though in Proto-Semitic and in Proto-Hebrew it started with a cha sound, in Tiberian Hebrew it was pronounced hamisha. Hamisha. Okay, interestingly, in modern Hebrew the cha is used again, but this has nothing to do with Proto-Hebrew. This is just a coincidence, and you might know that this pronunciation is under influence of European languages, and it is from the Ashkenazi and Sephardi tradition, because in the Yemeni tradition the ha is still used. The next letter is Tef. It is an emphatic T. As for Proto-Hebrew, we cannot say for sure whether it was pronounced glottalized or pharyngealized, so whether it was Ta or Ta. Maybe it changed at some point, but when we get to Tiberian Hebrew, we already have it described as being pharyngealized, so being equivalent to Arabic pharyngealized sounds like Ta. And so, for example, the word for good would have been pronounced Tov in Tiberian Hebrew. Tov. In Proto-Hebrew, maybe it was Tob, we cannot say for sure, but in Tiberian Hebrew, Tov. And in modern Hebrew, usually it is just pronounced as a plain T. The next letter is Yod. Yod, so this is a glide, this is a palatal approximant, though the most interesting thing here I maybe need to point out is that in Tiberian Hebrew, apparently it had two different pronunciations. The second one is an allophone that only occurred when this letter was geminated. So when you had like a yod with a darish. Okay, so for example, the first example, there's only a single yod or a plain non-geminated yod, and you would say yamin. But the second example, it has the dagesh, the gemination sign, and you would have pronounced this hadya in Tiberian Hebrew. Hadya. And you will see it very often at the beginning of verses, vadyomer, etc. Vadyomer Adonai. You will see it later in my examples. And this is, this seems a little odd, but typologically, looking at other language families around the world, this just looks like a fortition process. So the opposite of lenition, so which means that sometimes geminated like fricatives may become affricates, and approximants can become voiced stops, etc. So typologically, I don't think this is very unusual. It's just surprising for me personally to see this in Hebrew. This was something new, but yeah, it's interesting. Hadya. So the next one is kaf. It has two different pronunciations in Tiberian Hebrew, just like you note from modern Hebrew and from basically all, I think, pronunciation traditions. So there's not a lot to explain. Maybe I just need to point out that just like gimel, the fricative pronunciation of this is said to have been pronounced further back in the throat. So not just a velar fricative, but a uvular fricative. So not cha, but cha. Just like Arabic kha. Okay, so the first example, there you see the stop allophone at the beginning of a word, Kana'an, Kana'an, and the second one you see it post vocally, thus turned into a fricative, Ochel, Ochel, Kana'an, Ochel. Not a big difference. Basically no difference at all, I think, in comparison to modern Hebrew. The next letter is Lamed, and I think there's not much to explain. It's an L. Seems like it has always been an L, no allophones or anything, so the example is pretty easy. Lahem. Lahem. And also the letter Mem. There's not much to explain, no surprises, also no surprises in Tiberian Hebrew, so the example is Mayim. Mayim, water. The next one is Nun. Again, no big surprises, has always been an N, as in this example, Northon. Northon. Also the Samech, there are no surprises. Seems like it has always been a voiceless sibilant, so we have the example Sus. Sus. The next letter, as I told you before, in Proto-Hebrew it had the letter represented two different phonemes, namely the A and the Ra. So two voiced fricatives, one is pharyngeal, the other one uvular, but they have merged to the pharyngeal fricative in Tiberian Hebrew. So in Tiberian Hebrew, this word would be pronounced a'arev. A'arev. So it's like an Arabic ayn. And in modern Hebrew, I think hardly anyone pronounces it like that. So most people pronounce it like an aleph or just drop it at all. But the Tiberian pronunciation, a'arev. The next one is P. It has a fricative allophone like the other Begat Kefat or Begat Kefet letters, or whatever you want to call them. So there's a stop pronunciation P and a fricative pronunciation F. Also, this one is not bilabial if spirantized, but labiovelar, just like in modern Hebrew. So first example at the beginning of a word, ponim. Second example after a vowel, sophon. Ponim, sophon. So the next one is the emphatic S, the emphatic sibilant. In Proto-Hebrew, again, because it's emphatic, we cannot say for sure whether it was pharyngealized or an ejective, that is glottalized. And we also cannot say for sure whether it was just a sibilant or an affricate. So if it was glottalized, it was most likely an affricate. If it was pharyngealized, maybe one or the other, maybe it changed over time, we cannot say for sure. We can say for sure that in Tiberian Hebrew it was described as being just like Arabic sod, so just a pharyngealized sibilant, sa, as in this word, sadiq. Sadiq. Interestingly, in modern Hebrew, through the, I think, Sephardi and Ashkenazi traditions, it represents an affricate. I don't think it's a coincidence that it may have been an affricate in Proto-Hebrew. It surely was in Proto-Semitic and survived as this into modern Hebrew. I think there are maybe some other, even in the early Middle Ages, some other pronunciation traditions besides the Tiberian tradition. So maybe Jewish people in other parts of the Jewish world, of the Jewish Middle East, have retained this old African pronunciation, and this later became was reflected in the Sephardi and Ashkenazi traditions. So yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that we have this feature in Proto-Semitic and maybe Proto-Hebrew, but then in modern Hebrew. So the Tiberian tradition probably also only was one of several pronunciation traditions that coexisted at the same time. That's what I want to say. Okay, but focusing on Tiberian, I would pronounce this sa, as in sadiq. Next one is quf. Okay, quf. Again, Proto-Hebrew, can't be sure whether this was a uvular stop or an ejective, so qa or ka. But in Tiberian, it surely became qa, and in modern Hebrew, it merged with the letter kaf. So for that reason, this example in Tiberian would be pronounced qayin. Qayin. So now this one is a little odd, and I'm not 100% sure what it was in Tiberian Hebrew. So in Proto-Hebrew, it surely was what it was in most other Semitic languages, a kind of alveolar tap, flap, trill, something like that. So resh, something like that. But the Tiberian description is very interesting, and there are very extensive descriptions. But it turns out that it had two allophones, and the first one, which is the most common one, was, for example, according to the Hidāyat al-Qāriʼ, pronounced in the same place as Gimel, Kaf, and Quf, which is not one place but covers at least two places of articulation, namely velar and uvular, but it was not pronounced with the tip of the tongue. It was not in the same place of articulation as, for example, tav and samer, etc. So it seems like it was some kind of uvular rhotic, guttural rhotic, but the description from then on is not very precise, so it doesn't tell us whether it's a kind of trill sound like this, a uvular trill, so trilled in the back of the mouth, or a fricative, just like the spirantized gimel, and maybe the fact that resh cannot be geminated has something to do with this, but I don't really have an idea. Maybe it was something else, more like an approximant or a uvular flap. Things like that exist as well. Yeah, in this video I transliterated like this, but I'm not saying that it was definitely a uvular trill. So yeah, I'm just using this symbol for convenience, but I'm not sure whether it was pronounced r, or maybe still a little different. It also had an allophone, which was actually a trill and probably pharyngealized to an emphatic R, which also exists in classical Arabic, for example. And I will give you the rules for this allophone on the next slide. But yeah, just telling you, it was also pronounced ra in certain environments. So two examples. First one, raqiya. So here we have the normal form, raqiya. Second example, we have the other allophone, misrayim, something like that. Okay, modern Hebrew mostly uses the r, so raqiya and I think mitzrayim probably in modern Hebrew, or mitzrayim. But let me show you the rules for these two allophones on the next slide. So the letter resh is pronounced as apparently an alveolar trill and apparently also emphatic, pharyngealized, immediately after d, z, s, t, t, s, and the other s, so after samer and sin, which were pronounced the same in Tiberian Hebrew, l and n. There could also be a schwa between them, but for example, directly after sadi, you would get misrayim. Okay, misrayim. And it was pronounced the same way in closed syllables after the same group of letters plus vowel. So for example, this word, it's only one syllable. It starts with one of these and ends with a resh, so it is kind of an assimilation process, and it's pronounced sar. It is also pronounced like this immediately before lamed and nun, also possibly with a schwa in between them, so we would get this word with the pronunciation gorni, and also in closed syllables before a vowel plus L or N or lamed or nun, as in areil. Okay, so these are the conditions under which resh is pronounced as ra. Everywhere else, apparently, it was pronounced as a guttural R sound, so ra or ra maybe. Okay, these are the rules. Quite complicated, but phonological rules are sometimes complicated, and the speakers just do this out of intuition. So yeah, a reader of Hebrew in those days wouldn't have thought about this, but just done it intuitively. So we're almost done with the alphabet. So the next letter has two different ways of pronunciation. It was like that in Proto-Hebrew, still was in Tiberian, still is in modern Hebrew. In Proto-Hebrew, we have these two ways of pronouncing it as sh and lateral ch. Though in Tiberian, it seems like it is already merged with the samer. I think this already happened much earlier in standard biblical Hebrew. It was probably only pronounced like this, maybe in archaic biblical Hebrew. So these two examples in the Tiberian pronunciation would be shiv'a, so with a shin, shiv'a, and the next one with sin, asara, asara. And we finally reached the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the tav. Tav also has a fricative allophone, th. So we have these two examples at the beginning, Torah, Torah, and at the end, bath, bath. Okay, the fricative pronunciation doesn't exist in modern Hebrew, though the Ashkenazi tradition, as far as I know, has retained it, so they would say bas. But Tiberian is Torah and bath. And that is the alphabet. Now, apart from the alphabet, you also have vowel signs, and before I give you all the vowel signs, just want to give you the vowel length rules, because in Tiberian Hebrew, vowels were either short or long. Vowels were short in unstressed closed syllables and long either in open syllables or in stressed closed syllables. Okay, so these are just the very simple phonological rules for vowel quantity. So the first vowel sign is the pathah. Pathah, transliterated as a plain A, and the pronunciation was a, short or long, depending on the stress and syllable structure. In the environment of emphatic consonants like sadi or teeth or quf, it was pronounced a little further back in the mouth. The same thing is done in Arabic, and al-Faraǧ Hārūn has described this as also being as also happening in Tiberian Hebrew. So either a or a. So two examples, malka, and here you see it's short because it is in an unstressed closed syllable. So the syllable is mal, malka. But the second example, ka-thav, here the syllable is closed but it is stressed, so it is long, ka-thav, malka, ka-thav. Second vowel sign here in my list is qames, and it is pronounced as o. O. It can also either be long or short. In modern Hebrew, it has split into, it can be a sound that is identical to pathah, but it can also be identical to holam. So in modern Hebrew, and this is taken from the Sephardi tradition, I think, it is pronounced a or o, but in Tiberian, it was always o, short or long. So first example, in an unstressed closed syllable, yoshmath. So in this syllable is just yosh, okay, closed and unstressed, yoshmath. But the second example, in the first syllable is open and the second syllable is closed but stressed. So you would say Hārūn, Hārūn. And why do we have ra here? Because the resh is in a closed syllable followed by nun, so it becomes ra. So we see the rule applied here, Hārūn. The next vowel sign is serol, which is pronounced e, short or long, like in these two examples. Melech, so stressed and open, long. Second syllable is unstressed and closed, so it's short, melech. In this example, here it is in a stressed closed syllable, barzel, barzel. And here, by the way, the zayin does not have an effect on the resh because it follows the resh, but to affect it and to turn it into r, it would have to precede it. Okay, just in case you're wondering. Barzel. The next vowel sign is serré, serré, and this one is actually always long because it never occurs in closed, unstressed syllables. It only occurs in open and in stressed syllables, in stressed closed and stressed open syllables. So it's always long, e. So first example, c'est là, c'est là. Second example, bin, bin. Here we see the vowel sign hiriq, hiriq, which stands for e, short or long, and all the length rules and the general length rules apply here as well. That's why the first example is midbar, so short, midbar, midbar, and here it's long because the syllable is open, rishon, rishon, midbar, rishon. The next one is holem, which is o, and just like the seré, it is also always long because it does not occur in unstressed closed syllables. Hence, these two examples, Yehoshua, Qol. Now you're wondering, wait, there is a short o in the first syllable. Well, yes, but that is not a holem, that is a schwa or a sheva. And I will talk about the schwa rules later, but it is always short, but it can assimilate to following vowels. Hence, here we do have a short o, but it is not the holem. So the schwa can be a short o. Yehoshua. And finally, we have two different vowel signs representing the vowel u, short or long. I think in earlier Hebrew it is they're quite in free distribution, so you will see the same word sometimes written with these three dots called the qibus, sometimes with a wow and a dot, which is called the shureq. They're kind of in free distribution, and I think later they become they agree to certain rules, like the qibus is more used when it's in a closed syllable, and the shureq rather when it's in an open syllable, and this becomes pretty normalized, especially in Aramaic. But yeah, in earlier biblical Hebrew, those two are pretty much the same, and like I said, you will see one and the same word spelled with both signs. So the first one is qibus, second one is shureq, and there are two examples here. First, in a closed unstressed syllable, shulhan, shulhan, and the second one, sur, sur. And why is the resh pronounced as a r? Because it is in a closed syllable that starts with sadi. Okay, sur. And finally, the one you're probably wondering about, well, today you call it schwa, but in Tiberian it was probably pronounced shava. So the plain pronunciation of this is a, which means it is pronounced exactly like pathach. The difference is that it is always short, and the other difference is that it can assimilate to following vowels. I will show you that on the next slide, but the basic pronunciation of this was a. Like in this example, the Philistines, palishtim, palishtim, palishtim. And in case you're wondering, why did they have an extra sign for this? Why didn't they just use pathach? Well, one difference is pathach can also be long. This can only be short. Well, then the question is, what's the difference between this and hatif pathach? I guess maybe it's because when these descriptions of the pronunciation of Hebrew were written, the Tiberian vocalization already had been introduced a couple of centuries before, so at least 3 or 4 centuries before, and in 3 or 4 centuries, of course, changes can occur. So I guess these descriptions that we have from books like the Hidāyat al-Qāriʼ do not 100% accurately represent the way Hebrew was pronounced when the Tiberian vocalization was introduced. Get what I'm saying? So this is why the pronunciation of these vowel signs seems a bit odd, and Pathach, Hatif, Pathach, Shavah. It seems like, yeah, maybe Shavah was pronounced differently before, and it was an actual like schwa sound, which we would transliterate with this sign in IPA, if you get what I'm saying. So some of the Shavah assimilation rules, it's not much. The first rule is that it is assimilated to a vowel after a following guttural, which means aleph, he, heith, or ayin. So first example would be pronounced be'er. Second example, tihillah. Third example, mo'oz. Fourth example, ru'uven. Okay, let me read them again. Be'er, tihillah, mo'oz, ru'uven. And one other rule is that Shavah is assimilated to a following yod, so this would have been pronounced biom. Okay, biom. And there are some other vowel signs left, namely the so-called Hatif signs. These didn't exist in the prior vocalization systems, namely the Babylonian and the Palestinian vocalization, so these are an innovation of the Tiberian vocalization system, but basically these three are pronounced a, o, e, and are always short. So we have these examples: Hamor, Sa Horayim, so this one is short, first one is long, this one is short, this one is long again. Sa Horayim, oh sorry, it's a normal he, so Sa Horayim, Sa Horayim, and Elohim, Elohim. And the part with the long and short vowels, to me personally, trying to pronounce these things the way they were pronounced in the past, I think this part is the hardest, because for example, pronouncing the vowel here in the first syllable of Sa Horayim, I find that a little difficult, because I intuitively think I'm shortening all unstressed vowels here, even if they are in an open syllable, in an open unstressed syllable. So this part, if I'm practicing my reading, I may pay special attention to it, and when I present a text to you later, yeah, I might make some mistakes there, so sorry in advance. And now that I've introduced the whole alphabet to you, and I hope I didn't miss anything, I can present a text for you. The text is from the Torah, from Genesis. It's Genesis 12, or Genesis 12, sorry, Genesis 12. And I will read it to you verse by verse, and I will give you the original Hebrew text with the Tiberian vocalization, also with the cantillation signs, though I do not know how to read them. I cannot cantillate, so I will just read it like prose, and I will read it slowly so you understand all the fine nuances of pronunciation, and I will give it the transliteration. I will give you another transliteration that gives you some details of the phonetics, and I will also give you the translation so you can read it, follow along, and I will also maybe explain a couple of things on the run, but not too much. I will mostly just read. Okay, let's get started with the text. Vadyomer Adonai el Avram, lech lecha me'arsacha u'mimolavdecha u'mibeit avicha el ha'aretz asher arecha. And I don't think there's anything I need to explain here. Ve'e'escha la'roi gadol va'avorechacha va'araddala shamecha vehiye barocha. Va'avorcha mavorachecha Wumaqallelacha or vanivrachu vach. I'm sorry. Vanivrachu vacha kol mishpachoth ha adama. ודילך אברהם כאשר דיבר אליו אדוני, ודילך איתו לוט, ואברהם בן 5 שנים ו70 שנה, בצאתו מחרון. The last word, do you remember why I say ra? Yes, it is because of the nun in the syllable, because it is a closed syllable ending in nun. So I say me Hārūn. ודיקח אברהם את שרי אשתו, ואת לוט בן אחיו, ואת כל רכושם אשר רכשו, ואת הנפש אשר עשו בחרון, וייסעו ללכת ארצה כנען, ויבואו ארצה כנען. ויעבור אברהם בארץ עד מקום שכם, עד אלון מורה, והכנעני אז בארץ. ודירא אדוני אל אברהם, ויאמר לזרעך אתן את הארץ הזאת, ויבן שם מזבח לאדוני הנראה אליו. ויעתיק משם ההרה מקדם לבית אל, וידעלו בית אל מדיין, והעי מקדם, ויבן שם מזבח לאדוני, ויקרא בשם אדוני. וייסע אברהם הלוך, ונשוא הנרבה. ויהי רעב בארץ, וירד אברהם מצרימה לגור שם, כי כבד הרעב בארץ. I think I made one mistake there. I said Hūr, it must be Hūr, which is kind of counterintuitive because the spirantized Gimel and the Resh are so similar. There must have been some kind of difference between them, but I don't know what it is. Let me just try again. ויהי רעב בארץ, וירד אברהם מצרימה לגור שם, כי כבד הרעב בארץ. This is better. ויהי כאשר הקריב לבוא מצרימה, ויאמר אל שרי אשתו, הנה נא ידעתי, כי אישה יפת מראה את. והיה כי יראו אותך המצרים, ואמרו אשתו זאת, והררו אותי, ואותך יחדיו. אמרי נא אחותי את, למען ייטב לי ועבורך, וחייתה נפשי בגללך. ויהי כבוא אברהם מצרימה, ויראו המצרים את האישה, כי יפה היא מאוד. ויראו אותה שרי פרעה, ויהללו אותה אל פרעה, ותוקח האישה בית פרעה. מול אברהם היטיב בעבורה, ויהי לו צאן ובקר, וחמורים, ועבדים, ושפחות, ואתונות, ורמלים. וינגע אדוני את פרעה נגעים גדולים, ואת ביתו על דבר שרי אשת אברהם. Vadikra Pharaoh la Avram Vadiomer Mazoth Asithali Lamma lo Higavtali Ki Ishtachahi Lama Amarta Ahothihi Va'eqah Uthah li Isha Va'ata Hine Ishtachaqah Valich Vayasav Alav Paro Anashim Vayashalluhu Itho Ve'eth Ishto Ve'eth Kol Asherlo. And that is the whole Hebrew text. So I know that some people, I know this from your comments on my old videos, I know that there are some people who are apparently Jewish and read the Torah or the Tanakh from time to time, and I know that at least one person commented that they read it like this also for fun sometimes. So yeah, it can be fun to find out how this actually might have sounded in a different century, in the 11th century. So this is not the same pronunciation when this text was written down, because that would be Proto-Hebrew. But yeah, this is like the earliest pronunciation of which we have accurate descriptions, and this is good solid evidence, and this is interesting to find out, and this is much different from what the different surviving pronunciation traditions of Hebrew, what they sound like. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the way I'm doing this. So that's it for today. That's it for classical Hebrew. Stay tuned for my next video, which will be on the other Canaanite languages with text samples from Phoenician, Moabite, and maybe others. Thank you.